Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Israeli Elections 2022 Decision at Last Again. My name is Crystal Falcaro-Heaps, and I work with the Northwestern Israel Innovation Project here at Northwestern. And I just wanted to say a quick welcome to everybody for being here and taking the time today to be with us. I also wanted to let you know that we will have a short Q&A at the end of the session. So if you have any questions, you can start putting them in the chat. You'll see a little Q&A option at the bottom of your screen that you can click on and write in your questions. If you have any technical questions, we can screen those as well. So you can put them in separately and we will follow up with you. But at this point, I will pass it on to Elie Rekhess, who will introduce himself and the presentation. And just one more quick thing, this session is being recorded. You can also enable closed captioning as well. And if you have any questions from here on out, again, you can use the Q&A function and we'll screen those questions for any technical issues. So thank you again and welcome.
So it's me now, Crystal? Yes.
Yes, it's you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are on the globe. I'm Elie Rekhess, and I'm the Crown Visiting Professor in Israel Studies and head of the Israel Innovation Project. Perhaps a short word about the Israel Innovation Project, IIP. We are mostly focused on collaboration between Northwestern University and counterparts in the Israeli institutions of higher learning, mostly focusing on science and technology. Water is the main topic of ours, but we are also working in areas related to the traditional definition of Israel studies, politics, society, and culture. You're all invited to visit our website. I'd first start with a thank you note to Crystal Falcaro-Heaps, our program assistant, who is instrumental in organizing this event with endless efforts. I'd also like to thank all those who helped us spread the word, and there are many. So thank you for that. Let me introduce our speaker without further ado. So David Horovitz, we are old acquaintances going back to earlier periods in our career. David is the founding editor of Times of Israel, the fastest growing current affairs website in the Jewish world, with an average of some 8 million monthly users worldwide and 40 million monthly page views, which is a lot. Times of Israel provides an independent, non-partisan coverage of Israel, and I hope that this session of ours will also be a non-partisan, independent look at the political scene. They publish in Hebrew as well as in English, as well as Hebrew, French, Arabic, and Persian. Now, David is the previous editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post that you might have heard of from 2004 to 2011. And before that, he was the editor and publisher of the award-winning news magazine, the Jerusalem Report. 2014, he was awarded the Bnei Brit Lifetime Achievement Journalism Award. He has conducted endless and numerous interviews with succession of Israeli and international figures, and he's a frequent interviewee and commentator on CNN, the BBC, Sky, and other TV radio stations. He's the author of the 2004 titled Still Life with Bombers, Israel in the Age of Terrorism, and in 2000, a book entitled A Little Too Close to God, The Thrills and Panic of Life in Israel, which cannot be a better title for the beginning of our session today. And my questions will revolve around two spheres. The first one, the most important one, the domestic sphere, and then the regional, international. So on the domestic front, David, and I want to start with a short question, more detailed one will follow. So Israeli public is divided in its response to the elections. On the one hand, you have responses of shock, frantic disenchantment. People talk about dark age. Younger people speak about relocation. But on the other hand, you witness great satisfaction with the result. This is the real, truthful reflection of Israel 2022, and there isn't really any need to panic. So, very briefly, David, what's your take? How do you interpret the results of this spectrum of bright, dark, if I may say?
So first of all, hi, Elie, and thank you for the kind introduction. And I'm very pleased to be doing this. And hello to everybody who's watching us. I'll try to be independent and non-partisan. But you should know where I'm coming from, which is somewhere in the confused middle ground of Israeli politics. And I think that will probably become clear. As for a brief answer to your question, I'm not sure I can do that, but I'll try. I mean, we have a very pure democratic election system. People have issues with their systems all over the world, as I'm sure Americans and Brits and Israelis on this call will agree. In America, you can lose the presidency while winning the popular vote. In Britain, you can come second in every constituency in the land and get no seats in parliament. In Israel, almost every vote counts, with one caveat. So we have pure proportional representation, and people go out and they know that their vote really matters, provided they vote for a party that clears the threshold, which was set at 3.25% at these elections. These were our fifth elections in 4 years, which is why there's that again in the title for this webinar. We're kind of an abused electorate. And we had 4 elections that were so close that no stable governments emerged. There were different consequences, but broadly speaking, there was no strong majority. And in this case, these elections on November the 1st, so almost 3 weeks ago, by Israeli standards, a very definitive result. There are 120 seats in our Knesset, and Netanyahu and his allies, their bloc, they won 64 of them. So that's a big election victory. 64, that means 64 against 56. And while those 64, which is Netanyahu's Likud and the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, and this now dismantled alliance of far-right parties, they're pretty homogeneous, relatively speaking. They have some very common goals, policies, attitudes, and interests. The 56 on the other side are not united at all. They wouldn't all have sat in a coalition together easily, certainly not some of the Arab parties. So it was really a very dramatic victory. If you look at it in terms of the way the democratic election process played out. But in fact, it's a little more complicated than that. If you look at the raw votes, and this is an inexact science, but if you try to allocate them to sides of the political spectrum, basically the pro-Netanyahu camp got just a touch over 50% of the total vote, and the anti-Netanyahu vote just a touch under. Why weren't the elections closer? Because for reasons including that threshold that I mentioned. Netanyahu is an astounding politician, which is not always a compliment, but in terms of organizing his campaign, he made sure that almost no votes that would have been heading for him would go to parties that fell below the threshold. He brokered this alliance on the far right. On election day, he's 73 years old. He was out campaigning, incredibly energetic. In the run-up to elections, he had something called the BB bus, or the BB is coming bus. He would drive around the country. I don't think he did the driving, but he would be driven around the country in his glass windowed bus, and he'd pop up and turn up all over the place, and people had been told ahead of time, wooing everybody he could possibly woo. On the other side, the campaign was, the nice thing would be to say complacent, and the impolite thing would be dysfunctional. 2 parties slipped below the threshold. The most left-wing Zionist party, Meretz, and an Arab nationalist party, Balad. And between them, they threw away something like 300,000 votes. It's very easy to say, and some commentators have said, that if that hadn't happened, if Yair Lapid had marshaled his bloc more effectively, the outgoing prime minister, then the election would have been very close. There are people who you can just do a raw arithmetical calculation and assert that it might have even been 60-60. I don't buy that. I don't think you can guarantee that Meretz and Labour together, you can't tell how much better they would have done. You can't be sure that everyone who came out to vote for Balad, which split off from the other Arab parties, would have voted at all if Balad hadn't run separately. But clearly the election would have been closer. And therefore the premise at the beginning of your question, which is a country very divided and ranging in response from rapture to total despair, that 50-50 part of it is, it's fairly accurate.
So you don't really see a sea change, do you? I mean, because this is a term that has been used, and many spectators saw the result as unexpected for the right wing to have such a majority. And
so, every answer is more nuanced than is convenient, and I apologize. It is a sea change in terms of the people who are now going to govern Israel, and it's taking Netanyahu a little longer than expected, but have no doubt he will put together a coalition, and it will be a coalition of the far right, the ultra-Orthodox, and his increasingly hawkish Likud. So that's a real change. In terms of the electorate, did the electorate swing massively to the right? That's more complicated. It's not as easily definitively claimed, shall we say. But there are other factors here that point to something.
I want to sorry for interrupting. I mean, so
sure.
there are no tectonic movements here. I agree. If you look at the balancing number, however, there is a change. And my question to you, on a deeper analytical level, the strengthening of the right, the weakening of the so-called left. What explains this shift in the political behavior of the Israeli voter? Does it teach us something about the inner world of Israeli political society? I'm now going into the roots, or maybe this is a passing phenomenon that, next election. I mean, I have to say that the title of this webinar was chosen before we knew the results, and we didn't exclude the possibility of an ongoing deadlock. But so if we had to phrase it today, we would have chosen a different title. But yes, can you explain or relate to what is happening within the Israeli polity?
Yeah, so there are two parts of an answer that I want to give you. The first part actually relates to looking at what happened on the voting day and so on, where turnout was very high among the ultra-Orthodox community. That had an impact. It was lower in secular and left-wing and Arab circles. I think there were a lot of voters who felt betrayed by Naftali Bennett, who you'll recall was the prime minister in the last coalition. When they voted for his Yamina party a year and a half ago, they thought they were voting for a pro-Netanyahu party. And he didn't sit with Netanyahu in the end. Instead, he and Lapid set up Israel's most diverse coalition with parties from right to left and an Arab party, unified only by their desire to keep Netanyahu out of power. So I think the bigger picture is of an Israel that has moved to the right. In the outgoing Knesset, which was superseded last week when the new house was sworn in the outgoing Knesset, more than 70 of the Knesset members were from the Israeli right. That was not reflected in the coalition, but it was there. So Israel has been gradually moving to the right. It just didn't have stable right-wing coalitions because enough people on the right were so hostile to Netanyahu. And that changed this time when those Bennett voters, if you want to be less nuanced, broadly speaking, went and voted for the Religious Zionism Party instead. And therefore, the right, the people who thought they were voting for pro-Netanyahu parties did indeed vote for parties that have stuck with Netanyahu. So that right-wing advantage is now going to express itself in the coalition. And in terms of where Israel is moving, I would say that in the last 22 years, since the Second Intifada, which was a majorly traumatizing event for Israelis, we had a strategic onslaught of Palestinian terrorism. That combined with ongoing, as Israelis see it, Palestinian hostility and rejectionism, and added to that, the fact that when Israel has relinquished territory in the past 20-something years, we left southern Lebanon in 2000, Hezbollah took over, we left Gaza in 2005, Hamas took over, that has persuaded much of the Israeli middle ground that even if we want to separate from the Palestinians, in part because we want to keep Israel as both a Jewish and a democratic state, it's very difficult to do so. You have to have a viable partner, and you have to be able to safely relinquish territory. And middle ground Israel, less of it thinks that that is possible. If you look at what happened in these elections to the left, to the pro-land for peace parties, if you like, Labour barely scraped in and Meretz was obliterated. So I think bad management of the anti-Netanyahu campaign maybe brought about a unified right-wing Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox coalition earlier than might have been necessary if they'd campaigned more effectively. But that is the direction that Israel has been going. And the clear right advantage in the Knesset has only been kind of obscured by the fact that people on the right, like Gideon Sa'ar, who was Netanyahu's cabinet secretary and a minister, and Avigdor Lieberman, who was his finance minister and his foreign minister and sat in governments with him, they were in the anti-Netanyahu camp. They're still in the anti-Netanyahu camp, and yet the Netanyahu camp has become sufficiently strong now, even without them, to muster this majority.
So I have to ask you, you used the term bad management. So, you know, one may get the impression that this is only a question of management, that, you know, in the future, if the next, I don't know when the next election would be, we'll speak about the coalition in a minute. So if they perform better, then, you know, we might get, the tilt would go elsewhere. Is this correct?
Yeah, but not in terms of the big political undercurrent that you're trying to probe here, because the right-wing swing of Israel has been, like I say, partly obscured by antipathy to Netanyahu on parts of the right. Israel is moving to the right, has moved to the right. A better managed campaign this time might have been less unsuccessful, because, you know, the anti-Netanyahu forces could just possibly have mustered enough votes to keep him out. But you take Netanyahu out of that equation and you look at Israel and you try to assess how left-wing, centrist, right-wing, etc., religious it is, it's clear the direction of the electorate. It's also it's a function of demographics. I don't think anything is set in stone, and different politicians can change that balance and shift people. You know, one thing that happened this time was that moderate Orthodox Israelis, and I'm telling you this anecdotally, and I think it's very credible, many of them felt that although there are so many parties that run for election, they didn't feel that there was a party that spoke to them. They felt betrayed by Bennett. They didn't really want to vote, some of them, for the far-right religious Zionism alliance, but many of them did, because they didn't see a party that spoke, you know, better for them. Benny Gantz, the defense minister, maybe had a chance to win over some of those voters. He had a quite credible, Orthodox, impressive Israeli figure, a man named Matan Kahana, who was the Minister of Religious Affairs in the outgoing coalition. He didn't play him up. He didn't reach out to the moderate Orthodox. And therefore, there was a lot of bad management, but you can see where the deeper flux is heading.
Okay, so yes, I think we clarified that point, and let me move to the next issue on my agenda, and this is the coalition and the new government. So we are in the midst of coalition negotiations. It wasn't that fast as Bibi had hoped to. So are we going to have a government soon? And what kind of a government will it be? Let's leave apart the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir issues for a moment. But for example, on the socioeconomic level, will Netanyahu be able to resolve major issues like the housing problem, the growing inflation? And one small addition, there are talks about a unity government. Can you enlighten us on that? I mean, is there any chance for that?
Okay, I just want to point out to you that you're slipping in like 4 questions there, and then, you know.
I know,
It's pretty sneaky. Let me just do the last one first. I don't think there's going to be a unity government, and in fact, there's been progress today, we understand, in the negotiations with Smotrich, who indeed we'll come back to more later on. This is the only coalition I think that Netanyahu can assemble. I also think it's the only coalition he wants to assemble. Potential quote-unquote unity partners like Gantz, Lapid, they've all been burned by Netanyahu in the past. Lapid sat in government with him 9 years ago. Gantz rescued him 2 years ago and had a deal that they were going to rotate the premiership, which Netanyahu found a way to evade, sparking the 2021 elections. So Gantz is adamant he won't sit with him. Lapid won't, and Netanyahu is not asking them to. He's building a government of these four parties: Likud, Shas, United Torah Judaism, and the now splintered components of religious Zionism. How is it going to deal with socioeconomic issues, with housing, with inflation? Netanyahu is very strong on finance. The high cost of housing in Israel seems to be beyond the capacity of successive governments to rein in. There has been some evidence in the last few months that maybe things are easing a little. There's huge demand, there's very little supply, and it's hard to see how that changes unless they change the whole process by which lands are allocated for building. They have, over the years been improving our transport infrastructure, and therefore what is laughably referred to as the periphery, which are places basically an hour or an hour and a half away from Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, are more accessible. So I guess with time, it might be possible to lower housing prices. Inflation, we're struggling too. I think the Bank of Israel has just raised interest rates in the last hour or two for the umpteenth time recently. However, we're suffering less than some people on energy issues because we have more of our own energy supplies. Netanyahu, has got a good track record on the economy. What's going to undermine some of his efforts is the very nature of this coalition, and some of the demands that his own partners will be making, are already making, including the demands of the ultra-Orthodox parties, who basically, among other things, want to legislate in a way that hasn't been quite possible for them thus far. They want to make it a law that ultra-Orthodox young men are exempt from military service. By extension, this threatens to keep more of the ultra-Orthodox male population out of the workforce. There is a lot of discussion already about ultra-Orthodox demands for greater budgets, funding for ultra-Orthodox schools that don't teach core curriculum, state funding, which hasn't been there in the past. So there are going to be economic costs to this particular partnership that will strain the Israeli economy. And coming back to your first question about a divided country, some of whom are rejoicing and some of whom are in despair, Netanyahu will have to be careful that he doesn't create a climate in which tax-paying, hardworking Israelis who contribute greatly to the economy feel that they're being abused. I would say feeling abused economically and also militarily. One of the big divides in Israel is over non-equality of the burden, notably as relates to military service. And, it would be my strong preference, for example, that national service in one form or another be mandatory. It doesn't have to be an army service. And why wouldn't the ultra-Orthodox community want to perform national service if there were programs within their own community, whether it's in education or medical support or all sorts of things? So this seems to me to be something that's taking Israel in a potentially dangerous direction from every perspective, including the strain on the taxpayers, the sense of equality, and the economic macro situation.
Thank you. So we now come to the question that to me seems perhaps of greatest significance and importance with a look to the future, and this relates to the nature of the state of Israel. So Bibi, the other day when he went to Herzog, to the president, he reaffirmed his commitment to the, quote, the democratic process, end quote, the sovereign democratic state of Israel. However, there are many who are concerned that this government will undo some foundational principles of the state. How so? And pardon me for stealing 2 minutes of your time, your precious time. One, due to the rise of the hawkish right wing. Otzma Yehudit, Jewish religious Zionism, I think is the translation, which is not precise. I think the Hebrew is much stronger. It's Jewish fortitude, or I'm not, my English is not that good. But anyways, headed by Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the one being a staunch right-wing ideologue, settlements, the other being openly anti-Arab, anti-gay, advocate of Jewish prayer on Temple Mount. And the second development is the strengthening of the ultra-Orthodox party with all the ramification which you had alluded to, including revoking the state recognition of Reform conversions, and we'll come back to that. So my question is, will Israel remain as it is being described in the official website of the state as Jewish and democratic, or will it now become Jewish and Jewish?
So I think the election was, I don't think it was the knockout of Jewish Israel, or the knockout by Jewish Israel of democratic Israel, but it was certainly a success for parties that value Jewish Israel above democratic Israel. Certainly when you think of religious Zionism, which, just to clear up that confusion there. So you had three parties united under the banner of religious Zionism. One of them is Itamar Ben-Gvir's Otzma Yehudit, which translates as Jewish power, right? So Smotrich and his religious Zionism now carry on as a separate entity. Ben-Gvir with his Otzma Yehudit Jewish power are split off because it was a technical alliance, and so too a third faction called Noam, which is a very small, virulently anti-LG, anti-gay, homophobic, extreme anti-Arab party. So those three have now broken apart, but they're broadly speaking allied with their particular agendas. So, you know, that is a party that is Otzma Yehudit's faction, Mr. Ben-Gvir's faction, in its last manifesto, calls to annex the entire West Bank without granting Palestinian residents equality. Smotrich is also very hostile to Palestinians generally, I would say, and certainly in terms of Palestinian rights in areas that he would want to annex. We're hearing that he wants, in the coalition accords, some kind of commitment from Netanyahu to annex parts of the West Bank and so on. The ultra-Orthodox parties obviously value Judaism above democracy. Smotrich, I should stress, is on record as saying ultimately he thinks Israel should be a halachic state governed by Jewish law. The rabbis with whom he consults, it's not clear who tells who what to do. I rather think he tells them. Are certainly, some of them are publicly committed to Israel as a Jewish state. Now, I don't want to get carried away here. As I say, it's not the end of Israel as a democratic state by definition, but clearly there are forces here for whom Jewish Israel matters more than democratic Israel, and they are in the ascendant in Israeli politics at the moment. And you have this irony, if that's the word to use, where Netanyahu, who has basically mainstreamed people on the far right, such as Ben-Gvir, who brokered this alliance on the far right, he's really among the most secular politicians in his own coalition, including his own Likud party, where again he's relatively moderate and relatively strong in terms of a commitment to democracy. You're right that he spoke of democracy a couple of times in his speech last week. The previous week, on the night of the elections, in his victory speech, he did not use the word democracy at all. He gave a speech in the Knesset today, where again he spoke of democracy. You know, that's encouraging, but it's complicated. And one of the reasons why it's complicated, and we may discuss this a bit more, is that some of the I would say troubling in terms of democracy goals of some of his partners are potentially beneficial for him personally. So here you have someone who in the past spoke about the imperative to maintain the independence of the Supreme Court. He would quite like the Supreme Court to be reduced in power, if not neutered altogether, because it might help him extricate himself from his legal difficulties. So you have the person who might be the brake on the undemocratic agendas of some of his partners having his own interest in some of those processes. So it's It's not a rosy picture. We should not get carried away. The coalition has not been finalized. They haven't taken office. We don't know the specifics of legislation that they're going to advance, although we've heard suggestions about some of it, which is problematic democratically. I think we'll have enough time to wail if some of the most threatening legislation in terms of Israeli democracy does indeed get advanced. And remember, of course, when you have 64 members with a shared agenda in the 120-seat Knesset, whatever they want to get passed gets passed, unless the Supreme Court could stop it. And they want to stop the Supreme Court, or at least reduce the Supreme Court's capacity to break BRAKE, the executive hierarchy's agenda.
But still, I want to remain here. So we understand the situation on the legislative and the balance or imbalance of power. But what about the wide public? I mean, from what I follow and what I know, also from my own family, there are a lot of sectors in the Israeli public, many of the representing the younger generation, who would not succumb to that, who feel that we should revolt against this. We do not want to accept a quasi-halachic state with a significant reducing of the power of the judiciary versus the legislative and the Supreme Court. So, we in 2011 we had a wide public response of the younger generation on socioeconomic issues. Do you foresee any response on those sectors of the Israeli public who are extremely unhappy with what is happening? They're talking about the state of Tel Aviv that is more secular and more open. So on this level, do you see any potential response?
So the answer is I don't know, and it's a very good question. And you're right that 11 years ago there were very well conducted, very good-natured, but major protests over socioeconomic issues, notably including just cost of living and food and housing and so on. We've just had an election. It's coming up on 3 weeks. We don't have a new government in office. We hear about some of their plans. How will people respond to legislation if it takes the form that we believe? How will we can elaborate on the plans for the courts. How will the justices themselves respond if they feel that they are being, that the checks and balances of a democracy are being smashed, and that their capacity to ensure individual rights, remember, in a country with no constitution and no Bill of Rights, how will they respond? And will they be able to galvanize any effective protest? Will parts of, you're right again, if you want to be, really crude in talking about Israel, you talk about, people from the right tend to be Orthodox, tend to live in Jerusalem. People from the left, secular, living in Tel Aviv. They're only 60 kilometers apart, barely 40 miles, but there are two very different worlds. I'm making lots of crude generalizations, but you get the idea, and you know this. The Tel Aviv secular left-wing world lost these elections, and they lost these elections with no abuse of the democratic process. And they will, I'm sure people will try to champion the values that they hold dear. The question is, how bitter will first of all, how radical will the changes be, and how bitter will the counter efforts, which the only way to really unroll any changes that might be introduced would be for another process and another elections where people choose different leadership. Now, Netanyahu is aware of all of this, and Netanyahu, it's ridiculous that we speak so much about one individual, but he is so central. And he's calculating all the time. He does not want to provoke unnecessary unhappiness from those who didn't vote for him. He again, just in the last few minutes, he gave a speech picking up on some of the themes. He's said since the elections he wants to govern for the people who voted for him and those who did not. It's quite interesting because on the campaign trail, of course, anyone who opposed him was a dangerous leftist, but he became more conciliatory after winning. Today, he's kind of rolled it back a little bit, and he said, I'll try to govern, in a spirit, I don't remember the exact word that he said just now, but in a conciliatory spirit. But the fact is, the majority voted for me in terms of the Knesset seats provided and so on, and that's a factor for him too. So he'll try to negotiate in a way that keeps him securely in power. He may have tricks up his sleeve. It's not clear to me if Smotrich had played really hardball, whether Netanyahu would have blinked. I'm not sure Netanyahu would have blinked. It seems now that Smotrich is going to be the finance minister and not the defense minister. And if that's the case, Netanyahu has kind of diffused that particular challenge, I think, quite effectively, although he's giving Smotrich a great deal of influence. In other words, Netanyahu is no fool. He knows that as much as half of the country is somewhat dismayed to deeply anguished about the elections, he will not want to unnecessarily alienate, but he will also advance the agenda that he sees, he would say, as vital to Israel. His critics would say as serving his best interests, political and personal.
So David, I'm going to break the order of my questions and go to the last question. That is not that we have ended yet, but since you talk about Netanyahu or Bibi, so he's the longest serving prime minister, and you have portrayed his virtues as a statesman and a politician. And some suggest, like Zalman Shobal wrote a very interesting op-ed a couple of weeks ago, that he's the greatest, most experienced Israeli statesman since Ben-Gurion. Now, history teaches us, and I'm a student of history, about the discrepancies between rhetorics and practicalities. So are we for a surprise? Does he want to go down history as a person who really brought the Israeli nation to the fore and will be registered and remembered as the leading prime minister? What's your take on this?
These are questions for history to judge, I think, and hard for journalists to judge. And this is an interesting conversation for me because you do come at these issues from an academic point of view. First of all, it's unarguable that he's Israel's most experienced statesperson since Ben-Gurion. He's the longest serving prime minister ever. He's outlasted Ben-Gurion, and he's not finished yet. This incredible figure who has bestrode Israeli politics to the extent that a generation grew up here knowing nobody but Netanyahu as prime minister, except for a 1.5-year break with Naftali Bennett and a bit of Yair Lapid, which will be swiftly forgotten, I suspect. But he's domestically so divisive, and he's long been very divisive. And that's why you've had this extraordinary circumstance where an Israel that moved to the right did not have stable right-wing governments, because so many on the right who knew him best did not want to help him maintain his prime ministership. And he's overcome even them now. It's quite remarkable. I don't think he wants to go down as somebody who weakened Israel, right? And that's where, I mean, it is so complicated, and there are so many elements of this. But here's somebody who, in his speech at the president's house last Sunday, president's residence, said, I intend to widen the circle of peace. It was me who brought the Abraham Accords and the deals with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan. I think we can do more. And in that way, he said, we can solve the Israeli-Arab conflict. Well, what could be more wonderful than that? And then he went further. Right, this person who no longer speaks of a two-state solution with the Palestinians, even as an in-principle goal. And I have my very strong concerns about, I don't think we dare at this stage relinquish the territory that the Palestinians seek for their state. I do think that it needs to be an aspiration that we live alongside them in mutual security. I don't see how we can do that in the short term, but I do think we should always be open in principle to seeking a two-state solution. He doesn't even say that anymore, and yet in his speech the other day, he said, "I think that if we can widen the circle of peace with the Arab states, that's the way ultimately to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well." So this was someone who was not talking about managing a conflict and endless friction and violence. No, he has a declared aspiration to find some way to solve even the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The problem is, how do you do that? How do you do that if you are now governing with parties on the extreme right who want to annex territory? You yourself, Mr. Netanyahu, he forewent annexation in order to achieve the agreement with the United Arab Emirates, right? He was ready to annex territory, the settlements, and maybe the Jordan Valley when he thought the Trump administration would agree. The Trump administration made clear it would not. In a fiasco that is still being debated, he didn't annex. And then as part of the non-written understandings with the UAE, he chose not to annex any parts of the territories, including the settlements, because he preferred to widen the circle of peace. So, he has some credibility in terms of what we would call statesmanship and so on. But how do you reconcile that with partnerships with the Smotriks and the Ben-Gvirs who want to ease the open fire regulations? Ben-Gvir wants Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount, which we could talk about also for an hour. But if you were to do that, you would, without a doubt, be causing a great deal of friction, and who knows where that would lead. It's going to be very difficult for him, and it's not convenient for him. He would rather have a more balanced coalition. But as I said before, he alienated the potential more dovish politicians, and he, because of that corruption trial, apparently is prepared to go along with agenda items that will stain his legacy, I would say, if they play out the way we think they may play out.
I'm smiling because one of the slogans of the pro-Bibi camp this time and in past year was in Hebrew, ukosem, ukosem, ukosem. Kosem being a magician. He can do everything. By the way, it's not my personal viewpoint. I just posed the question. I'm not part of the answer. But yeah, who knows? And I think that I personally think that this needs to be taken. And I'm saying this as indeed more academically so, and perhaps from a viewpoint of a student of history. But time is running, and a quick question on the on the Abrahamic agreements. Do you think Saudi Arabia is next? Which would again, okay, this is an unfair question. I agree. Okay, delete.
I'm happy to. I don't know, and I don't think it's impossible, and I think it's a function of the concerns about Iran, where Israel under Netanyahu is the credible regional heavyweight if you're trying to tackle Iran. And the fact is, between Israel and Saudi Arabia, there are already all kinds of interactions beneath the surface. There are some above the surface. The very fact that we are now in the same military area as the Saudis in the United States division of its military organizations mean that we're in contact with the Saudis in all kinds of forums where it's banal and not particularly dramatic. So there is a relationship there already, and obviously the UAE would not have formalized ties with Israel without Saudi implicit or even explicit consent. So the ties are warming already, even if not at a formal level.
We should also throw, just as an addition, Turkey and the warm welcome that Netanyahu got from Erdogan after his election. So yeah, things are happening.
Shared concerns over terrorism, and in the case of Erdogan, a relationship that can collapse again overnight should the mood take him. It's a little different with the Saudis and with our Gulf allies, where it's a deeper association, and it also can change, but it's not going to change overnight on the whims of an individual.
Yeah, so we already got into my second circle of the regional and international, and we dealt with some of the issues I had on my list. But I want to move first a quick word about the relation. You mentioned Trump, and I'm interested to know your viewpoint on the future relationship with the Biden administration. Particularly after the recent midterm election in the US that did not bring about the expected result on some parties. So what do you foresee here? I mean, or no, I don't want to ask you about what you foresee. How do you look at that?
Look, Joe Biden was in Israel pretty recently. It was a very, very successful visit. He was incredibly warm in the things that he said about his feelings for Israel, his commitment to Israel, and I don't doubt that. And I think the fundamentals are pretty solid. I also think it's very significant if it turns out to be the case that Smotrich is not going to be the defense minister. In other words, you're not going to have somebody who I think the Americans would have a very hard time interacting with, if they were prepared to interact with him at all. We're talking about intelligence sharing. We're talking about the most intimate cooperation. And instead, if it's somebody like Yoav Gallant, who's a senior Likud member, who's a former senior Israeli army general, that's a minefield that Netanyahu has been careful to dodge, as far as I can tell. So he's aware of, the potential for specific areas of real trouble because of this coalition, and it seems that he is moving to ensure that there is no unnecessary friction. He spoke at the Republican Jewish convention at the weekend in Las Vegas, and he gave a pretty, he was speaking to one party, obviously, but he gave quite a bipartisan speech, and he said some fairly nice things about Biden and mentioned Obama in positive context and explained some of what had happened in that fraught relationship. He is trying to minimize friction, and that's what I think we'll continue to see him do. And therefore, with this administration, he might be able to, square all the circles somehow, might. But of course, if Ben-Gvir and Smotrich assert themselves, especially on the Palestinian front, that is going to be trouble. And down the road, that's a whole different story. You've got an American president who said in Israel, I've been in government for 50 years. I've been watching the dreams of Israel's founding fathers come to fruition. And it's been, something not almost akin to a miracle for me, or words to that effect. That's what Biden said in an address during his visit here. It's hard to imagine any possible democratic leader. It's hard to imagine many leaders anywhere in the world, however well disposed towards Israel, who would think and speak in those terms. And certainly in the US Democratic Party, there are potential leaders who are considerably less warmly disposed towards Israel at the best of times. And now we are likely to have a government that will be a source of great delight, I fear, to some of Israel's critics, if some of its more dramatic agenda items come to fruition. So Netanyahu, Biden, the short term, the rest of this Biden term, who knows what happens after that. In this term, Netanyahu is trying to dodge the minefields, that's for sure. Beyond that, it could get much more complicated, depending on where the Israeli government goes and who comes to power in the United States.
Yeah, the thoughts that go through my mind, I would throw into our discourse one term, a word that we haven't used yet, and this is pragmatism. That this might be the slogan or the leading. I see. Okay, so I see Crystal here, and this is a sign that we need to open it for Q&A. But before that, I have one more issue, which I think is relevant to many of our listeners, and this is the relations with American Jewry, particularly since there were talk about changing the conversion or no longer recognizing reform conversion, changing the law of return, what is known as the grandchild clause. So do you see any, with the government, forget about Bibi, but the government with Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, do you see a growing alienation, a potential, God forbid, rift between certain parts of American Jewry and Israel? This is no longer the Israel that we aspire to.
I think we're already seeing signs of dismay and discomfort. The Conference of Presidents, the umbrella organization of American Jewish organizations, its head, who's very circumspect and does not like to criticize Israel publicly at all, expressed concern about the potential change to the law of return. The head of the reform movement in the United States said yesterday that putting Ben Gvir in charge of the police, as is apparently very likely to happen, is akin to making the head of the KKK your attorney general. There are, I've had conversations with leading figures in non-Orthodox streams of Judaism who are very concerned. And remember, the Israel of before November the 1st was not applauded universally by American Jews in the first place. To my mind, often unfairly criticized. The Israel of the new Netanyahu coalition, I think, will find itself more vulnerable to criticism from people, including from people who truly do love and care about Israel and want it to flourish. So it's potentially a very sticky period in terms of Israel diaspora relations, as it is in all the other areas we've covered: domestic friction potentially in the region with allies around the world, and the emboldening of critics around the world. It's going to be, if Netanyahu is indeed a magician, he's going to need to be at his best. And I know, Krista, I know you want to shut me up, and that's fine, and take some questions. I just want to add one other thing, which we should just bear it in mind, because we're talking about Netanyahu here. So he's got this coalition, which I've described to you as the only coalition that he can realistically put together. That's today, on November the 21st. And that, it seems to me, will be the coalition that is sworn into office. That does not mean that a few months down the road, Netanyahu doesn't say, you know what, it's impossible to deal with you or I don't know who, and then reaches out to Gantz and says, listen, I don't want Israel to be defined by this or that extreme person with whom I am in government now. I will fire him if you will come and join me and secure my majority, and you'll have real influence. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I don't even know what the odds are of that happening. But what Netanyahu says next week or this week when he swears in the coalition, that will be relevant for the day that the coalition is sworn in. I don't think it has any guarantee in terms of future performance.
David, now you spoke as an academic.
Okay, I'll definitely take that as a compliment. Thank you.
Absolutely. Crystal.
I was going to say, you ended on the note of one of the questions about how the government will affect Israel's relationship with diasporic Jews. So we can take that one out of the chat. But one of the first questions came at the beginning of the session regarding the elections. Taking Bibi out of the equation, isn't the electorate a natural 65-70 seat majority?
Isn't the
electorate a natural 65 to 70 seat majority?
For the Israeli right, I guess, is what the question means. Take. I
imagine.
If I understand the question, yeah, I hope if I'm misunderstanding the question, then correct me by all means. The outgoing Knesset was a 70-strong right-wing majority, but Netanyahu was in the equation, and therefore the last coalition was put together to keep him out. If you start doing the maths for this coalition, for this Knesset, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because there's 64 in the Netanyahu bloc. There's Avigdor Lieberman's party, who are on the right of the spectrum. There's the Gidon Saar part of Benny Gantz's National Unity Party. So we're certainly well up above the 70 again. So the electorate, in terms of the way the raw vote played out, in terms of the way the Knesset seats played out, but even in terms of the way the raw vote played out, if you analyze not on pro or anti-Netanyahu, but if you analyze on right wing or left wing, there is again well over 70, I would say, members of the Knesset with because of the commensurate public support on the Israeli political right, and therefore, as I said, and as Netanyahu is saying, the process largely reflected where the Israeli electorate is going. When you factor in all kinds of other elements, including turnout high in the ultra-Orthodox community, low among the Arabs, and so on. But yeah, there's a right-wing majority in Israel for sure. And Netanyahu has managed to bring that to bear, even though parts of the right are so hostile to him.
So the next question, David, why do you think that the pre-election Israeli government did not put the stops on Arab land grabs in Area C? Did they not understand that this further emboldens violent Palestinian responses? What path on this specific issue will Netanyahu advance? And you might have answered it in the conversation throughout.
No, I don't think I did. I think the outgoing coalition would say that they have tried to act effectively, certainly including in the Palestinian arena. Maybe less so in terms of illegal building, but in terms of IDF proactive operations, you just look at the daily overnight raids by the Israeli army into Palestinian areas to tackle violent groups and to thwart potential acts of terrorism. There's been a much more robust government overseen military policy trying to tackle Palestinian extremism and terrorism in the last few months than there was for some time under Netanyahu, ironically or otherwise. I imagine that the new coalition will be, Netanyahu is no military adventurer. I mean, this is, again, he's such a fascinating politician and such an effective politician in so many areas. He's going to have a right-wing coalition. There are people in this coalition who will be urging more force to be used against Palestinians. Ben Gvir, as I did mention, wants to change the open fire regulations. Ben Gvir just a few weeks ago was in Sheikh Jarrah, a contested Jerusalem neighborhood, brandishing his pistol and encouraging the border police officers who were protecting him from Arab stone throwers to fire at them. And they did not believe their lives were in danger, and therefore they did not fire on them. You're going to have forces like that in the coalition, and Netanyahu, I suspect, will certainly, in terms of areas that would stoke conflict, he will try to avoid conflict while not wanting to be portrayed as weak.
Thank you. And I know we only have a few minutes left. Are you okay with going a little bit over the hour?
Absolutely, sure.
We only have a few more questions in here. So the next question was, what does the rightward movement augur for relations with the U.S., especially given the rise of anti-Zionism?
Look, the concerns, we've dealt with some of them in terms of relations with people in the United States who are very supportive of Israel from the president on down. This is going to be a fraught period, depending on how influential and successful the more extreme elements in this coalition are, and depending on how much Netanyahu chooses or is able to rein them in. Again, it's early days, and just the last few hours, after days and days when one of the most uncompromising and unyielding Israeli politicians, Bezalel Smotrich, was insisting on being defense minister, it appears that Bezalel Smotrich is not going to be defense minister. I don't want to get carried away in the other direction. He's still going to be a very influential figure. He's still going to have a great deal of authority. But there is room for Netanyahu to maneuver, and he will try to maneuver. He will not want to hemorrhage support for Israel in the diaspora. He will not want to make it easy for critics of Israel to marshal ostensible evidence with which to bash us. But the fact is that the electorate spoke, and these are the people that it elected. And this is the only constellation with which Netanyahu can govern because of all kinds of factors, including his political history. He will try to be as effective as he can. And again, we keep coming back to this one person, but really he holds so many of the keys. And we'll see how effective he can be.
Thank you, David. Elie, did you want to intervene? Please let me know. I have 2 or 3 more questions and then we can wrap it up, or okay.
No, okay, go ahead. David agreed.
Sure.
Okay. So one of the questions was, is the 2-state solution dead now?
I mean, there are people who tell you it's dead already because either Palestinian rejectionism means that the notion of an Israeli majority supporting a viable 2-state solution is unthinkable for the foreseeable future, There are people who will tell you it's dead already because settlements have expanded to the point where you can't have a viable contiguous Palestinian entity. I'd like to believe neither of those. Israel was revived by the UN in 1947 on the basis of a two-state solution. And I think, you know, it's in our foundational document, the Declaration of Independence. We reach out our hand for neighborly relations and so on. We want, when I say we, I'd like to think most Israelis, many Israelis, certainly myself, I would like to maintain this mini miracle that we've been able to be a Jewish majority state in the only place where the Jewish people were ever sovereign, and a democratic state with equal rights for the non-Jewish minority. I want us to be able to maintain that, and that means separating from millions of Palestinians. It's not simple because of the things I've made clear in this conversation about the dangers of relinquishing territory when you don't have a leadership on the other side that is striving to persuade its own people of our legitimacy here and the imperative to live securely alongside each other. But I hope the two-state solution is not dead, even though I don't believe that it is implementable in the near future. And I think that changes through education and a gradual creation of a climate where people truly seek coexistence, and we are, you know, some distance from any climate like that at the moment.
Thank you. And I'll go with the last question that we have here. Why does Israel appear so quiet about escalating anti-Semitism attacks in the US, and will this change under Netanyahu?
Look, I don't think people are, you know, I run a website that covers Israel and a lot of the Jewish world. And so I see a lot of material. I know what's going on. I don't think Israelis are indifferent to it. I think they're aware of it. I think they're troubled by it. I think it feeds into their sense of what should be done and their worldview and so on. You know, we reestablished this state because of the unthinkable consequences of anti-Semitism in its most extreme form in the Holocaust. So I don't think there's indifference. I think there's concern, and I think I'm sure. I mean, you know, the Prime Minister likes to think of himself, the incoming Prime Minister and all Israeli Prime Ministers want to think of themselves as, yes, the Prime Ministers of Israel, but also the leader of the world's only Jewish state with a great deal of responsibility for world Jewry. I hope Netanyahu, with this particular political alliance, will be sensitive to the implications of things that happen here. Certainly not the only factors driving anti-Semitism by any means, but I hope there is sensitivity here. I believe he is sensitive and concerned and shares everybody's dismay at the signs and the evidence of spiking anti-Semitism all over the place.
Thank you, David. And if we didn't get to any of your questions, we'll try to answer them post-session, but I'll pass it on to Elie for closing remarks.
Yes, well, I'm not going to make or give a summary. We covered a lot of mileage during this hour, and thank you, David, for so eloquently, intelligently handling all these difficult issues, and we survived. And I feel that as if you're writing 5 or 7 op-eds during this conversation and discourse. I hope that we will have more of that, and I want to thank you wholeheartedly for your participation. For those of us who perhaps feel unhappy with what we heard, I would like to quote what is attributed to Mark Twain when I think he first heard the music of Gustav Mahler, and then he said, "It's not as bad as it sounds." So I don't know, I'll throw in my 2 cents. I don't know if it encourages you or the others. We are non-partisan, as we mentioned in the beginning. I thank everybody, Crystal again, and all those who helped us. At the peak, we had nearly 100 participants, which is makes me happy. And this will be the recording will be on our website. And David, I look forward for more such ventures. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elie, and thank you, everybody. Thank you. Take care.